it's just a few months after Roe v. Wade was overturned back in June. So now in November, let's reflect. How much of the issue of abortion mattered to voters?
As we're seeing from exit polling, a tremendous amount. Exit polling shows that the top two issues that voters were considering as they went into the polls yesterday were inflation and abortion. In that order, though I would argue that the two are deeply intertwined.
So let's take a step back. So in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned back in June, there have been polls conducted about how Americans feel about abortion. Can you walk us through that?
I think it's important, and it does depend on the poll that you're looking at and talking about. But speaking broadly, a majority of Americans don't want to see abortion be illegal. Most Americans, anywhere between 55, 60, 63, 65, again, it depends on the polls, but more than 50% of Americans say that abortion in some form should be legal. So we have a majority of Americans who feel that the Dobbs decision in June, which overturned Roe v. Wade and took away the federal legal right to abortion, meaning that now it's in the hands of the states, I think a lot of Americans thought that was a really extreme decision. And then we're seeing in the exit polling a reflection that that issue didn't go away when the calendar turned to July.
So let's break that down. Are more women feeling that way, or are men leading that charge as well?
A lot of the polling I've looked at hasn't broken down women or men, but I know some of the individual state polling heading into the election. I'll use Oklahoma as an example, where we did see the incumbent Governor Stitt hold on to his seat, but he received a pretty stiff challenge from Joy Hoffmeister. She changed her affiliation. She was a lifelong Republican, school superintendent, and one of the issues that was helping her in the polling were women in Oklahoma cities plural, not Oklahoma City alone, were supporting her because they found that Stitt's anti-abortion legislation was just too extreme. Numbers didn't totally bear out for her. She was not one of the women who won last night, but I do think it was top of mind for a lot of women.
So how much would you say did the issue of abortion and reproductive rights in general energize voters, particularly Democrats?
It's hard to put a number on it, but I think if you see the abortion measures, there were 5 last night. There's still one that we're waiting on the results. And if you look at some of the governor races, I think it can't be overstated. I think a lot of the feminist activists who you've heard over the past few months saying that this is important, they were right. Everyone who was sounding the alarm saying we can't go back, we won't go back, I think there's proof that a lot of people agree with those sentiments.
Yeah, and for months we've been hearing from pollsters, from really everyone, that there was this red wave kind of coming. That didn't come to fruition last night. Do you think abortion played a key role in that?
I do. I think women are angry. I think anger is a powerful emotion in any arena, but if you think about the number of women who have been running for seats in recent years, we called it the pink wave back in 2018. There was anger about the election results in 2016. And when people are angry, and I've heard this from women I interview all the time, I ask them, prominent leaders and entrepreneurs, like, when do you decide to use your platform? One of them told me recently, when I'm pissed off. So I think you're seeing that when you're angry, you take your voice and you use it in some capacity. And for a lot of the women in this election cycle, we have women using their voice as their vote. And you also had women using their voice as running for a seat.
So did Republicans miscalculate how big of an issue abortion was going to be?
In my opinion, yes.
So you talked about voters in 5 different states reacting to ballot measures that had anti-abortion measures on them. Can you break that down for us?
Yes. So it's the wording of each of these measures is very complicated. We had a few that were worded in a way that would enshrine protection for reproductive health decisions into their state constitution or legislation. Then there are the other trickier protect the unborn or doctors, a mandate for doctors. So let's break that down. I'll start with California because that one's pretty simple. They enshrined the right to abortion in the state constitution.
So this can never be changed, right?
So currently California is one of the states where abortion is legal, and the state constitution allows a right to privacy, which has long been what Roe was decided on. You have the decision is between you and your doctor. But I think following the leak of the Supreme Court decision in May, when it was still just a draft, Governor Newsom and other state politicians decided, let's make sure there's no shadow of a doubt, and let's have this ballot measure to further protect the right to reproductive choice in this state.
Let's talk about Vermont next.
I think this one's really interesting because the language that voters were voting on was expansive. It is, and I'm going to read from here to make sure I get it right. Protect every person's right to make their own reproductive decisions. That means a lot of things. That means contraception. That means IVF. That means maybe you're being told by a doctor that it's a high-risk pregnancy, but you have the choice to go through with that pregnancy. It is protecting all sorts of reproductive decisions, which I think is really important because we want choice for everyone in how they craft their family.
And what was the response for voters on this measure?
There was a vote in 2018 where they were voting on abortion access. More voters came out this year than came out in 2018. So they voted in favor of reproductive choice by a wide percentage.
And let's talk about Kentucky next.
Kentucky was one of those states where voters were voting on something a little trickily worded, if you will. They were voting on a measure to say that an amendment to the state constitution to say that it does not, quote, secure or protect a right to abortion or funding of the abortion. So it's like a negative of a negative,
Okay.
basically.
Is this meant to trick people?
You would have to ask the people who write the legislation. I think a lot of times the wording is confusing, and I would argue that that's probably not a coincidence.
Got it.
But Kentucky is a state where abortion rights have been curtailed, so it's not as if this suddenly undoes all of this. I think the biggest takeaway in Kentucky is pro-abortion activists and lawyers will be able to continue fighting against the anti-abortion legislation or any further pullbacks in rights.
Maggie, you and I are both from the great state of Pennsylvania, and last night Pennsylvania Democrat Josh Shapiro beat out his GOP Republican challenger Doug Mastriano. So what does this mean in terms of reproductive rights?
It means, and Shapiro had campaigned on this, that any sort of abortion ban proposal that crossed the governor's desk, Shapiro will veto.
Okay, now moving on to some southern states, Republican incumbent governors held on to their seats in both Georgia as well as Florida. So what does this mean for abortion rights in those states?
They've already been curtailed, so let's put it this way, they're not getting expanded under these governors.